I heard my daughter-in-law laugh and say, "Don't worry, Margaret's used to living off us." And the table erupted like it was the funniest thing anyone had said all afternoon. But I didn't react. I just smiled and took another bite of my food as if I hadn't just been reduced to a punchline in front of my own family. As if the years I had spent building everything they now enjoyed meant nothing at all. And that was the moment I realized something had quietly shifted, not just in how they saw me, but in how far they believed they could go without consequence. And what they didn't know was that earlier that morning, before I even chose the dress I was wearing or packed the casserole I brought to share, I had already made a decision that would change everything they thought they understood about me, about control, about who was really depending on whom. But I kept that to myself as I sat there at that long folding table in my son Daniel's backyard, surrounded by relatives who used to greet me with warmth, but now offered polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The kind of smiles people give when they've already decided where you stand in their lives. And I could feel it in the way conversations moved around me rather than through me. The way Ashley effortlessly guided the energy of the gathering like she owned not just the house, but the narrative itself, her voice light and charming. Her laughter just a little too sharp if you listen closely, and I wondered how long this had been building, how many small moments I had brushed aside, how many times I had chosen peace over clarity, telling myself that family required patience, that love meant giving more than you received, that eventually things would balance out. But sitting there under the soft afternoon sun with paper plates and iced tea sweating in plastic cups, I saw it clearly for the first time, not as a misunderstanding or a passing comment, but as a pattern, one that had been quietly shaping the way they spoke to me, about me, and eventually around me. And I noticed how Daniel didn't look at me after she said it, how he kept his eyes on his plate like there was something very interesting about a piece of grilled chicken. And that hurt more than the joke itself, because silence, especially from your own child, can say things words never could. And still I didn't react, not because I didn't feel it, but because I understood something they didn't, that sometimes the strongest response isn't immediate, it's patient, it's deliberate, it waits until the right moment when the truth can't be laughed off or dismissed. And as Ashley leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased with the ripple of amusement she had created, I realized she truly believed I was harmless, predictable, someone who would continue showing up, bringing food, offering help, and quietly accepting whatever version of me they found most convenient. And for a long time, she had been right. But not anymore, because that morning, while they were still asleep in their comfortable home, I had been sitting across from a polished desk, signing papers with steady hands, listening carefully as everything was explained in calm, precise terms, and walking out with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, a clarity that made moments like this feel different, less like wounds and more like confirmations. And so I stayed quiet. I smiled when expected. I listened as conversations moved past me, and I let them believe that nothing had changed, because sometimes the most powerful shift is the one no one sees coming until it's already too late to undo. I stayed at that table longer than I needed to, long enough for the laughter to fade into smaller conversations, and for the moment to settle into something almost invisible, the kind of moment people forget as soon as it passes. But I did not forget. I noticed everything. The way Ashley leaned into Daniel as she spoke to others, confident and at ease. The way my sister-in-law avoided my eyes when our gazes almost met. And the way no one thought to circle back and say that the joke had gone too far, because to them, it had not gone too far at all. It had landed exactly where they believed it should. And that realization sat heavier than any harsh word ever could, because it meant this was not a slip. It was a reflection, a quiet agreement that I had somehow become less than what I used to be in their lives. And I thought back to how different these gatherings had once felt, when I was the one organizing everything, when the backyard filled because I made sure there was enough food, enough chairs, enough warmth for everyone to feel welcome, when Daniel used to call me the night before just to ask if I needed help. And now I was just another guest, one who brought a dish and kept quiet, one who could be turned into a passing comment without anyone pausing to consider how it might feel. And I realized that the shift had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, almost careful, built through small adjustments that I had ignored, like the time Ashley suggested it would be easier if holidays rotated between families, and somehow my home was no longer part of that rotation. or the way decisions about the grandchildren were made without ever asking my opinion. Even though I had spent years raising Daniel on my own after his father passed, learning how to stretch every dollar, how to make sure he never felt the weight of what we did not have. And I had been proud watching him build his life, proud enough that I never questioned how quickly my role had been reduced once Ashley stepped in and began shaping things in her own image. Always polite, always smiling, always just persuasive enough that no one noticed how firmly she guided every outcome. And I had told myself that this was normal, that families change, that boundaries are necessary, that I should be grateful for the time I was given. But sitting there that afternoon, listening to conversations that did not include me, I saw the pattern more clearly than I ever had before, not just in Ashley, but in Daniel too, in the way he had slowly stopped defending me in small moments, in the way his silence had become his position, and I wondered when exactly he had decided that it was easier to agree with her than to stand beside me, or if he had even realized it himself. And yet, even with that thought, I did not feel anger the way I might have years ago. What I felt was something quieter, something steadier, like a door closing inside me that I had left open for far too long. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a different version of things, one where I was not waiting to be included, not hoping to be appreciated, not adjusting myself to fit into a space that had already been reshaped without me. And that thought did not bring panic the way I expected. It brought a strange kind of calm, because I already knew something they did not, that the foundation they believed was fixed had already begun to shift that morning. And as I picked up my empty plate and walked toward the kitchen to set it down, I realized I was no longer trying to hold on to what this family used to be. I was preparing for what it was about to become. The kitchen felt quieter than the backyard, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clink of dishes against the counter creating a kind of stillness that allowed thoughts to settle in a way they could not outside. And as I placed my plate in the sink, I noticed how familiar this position was, how naturally I had stepped into the role of clearing up after everyone else while the laughter continued behind me, as if nothing had shifted at all. And for years I had told myself that this was simply part of being a mother, part of loving a family that had grown beyond the version I once held together. But now it felt different, not heavier, just clearer, like finally seeing a reflection without distortion. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, drawing my hands slowly, giving myself time to observe rather than react, to listen to the tones of conversation drifting in through the open door, the way my name came up in passing, casual and light, as if I were a detail rather than a person. And I realized how easily people adjust to a version of you that benefits them, how quickly they stop questioning it once it becomes convenient. And I thought about the morning again, about the quiet office with its neutral walls and steady air conditioning, the calm voice explaining each line as I nodded and signed without hesitation, not out of impulse, but out of certainty, because certainty does not need to be loud. It does not need to announce itself. It simply settles in and changes the direction of everything that follows. And I had walked out of that building with the same measured pace I had always carried. No dramatic gestures, no visible shift, but something inside me had aligned in a way it had not in years. And now standing in that kitchen, I could feel the contrast between who I had been just days ago and who I was becoming. And it was not anger driving that change, it was understanding. The kind that comes when you stop explaining away patterns and start accepting them for what they are. And I thought about all the times I had stepped in quietly, covering expenses that were never acknowledged, offering help that was expected rather than appreciated, adjusting my schedule to fit theirs without ever asking if they would do the same. And I realized that none of it had been wasted. It had simply been taken for granted, folded into a narrative where my presence was assumed, but my value was negotiable. And that was the part that had shifted, not in them, but in me. Because once you see that clearly, you cannot return to pretending it is something else. And I picked up a dish towel and wiped the counter even though it did not need it, more out of habit than necessity. And then I paused, placing the towel back down, because for the first time in a long while, I questioned whether I needed to continue playing a role that no longer fit. And outside I could hear Ashley's voice again, light and effortless, guiding another conversation. And I wondered if she would notice the difference when it finally surfaced, not in words, but in actions that no longer aligned with what she expected from me. And I realized that she would not see it immediately, because people rarely notice when the ground beneath them begins to shift. Not until they try to stand on it and find that it no longer holds the same way it used to. And with that thought, I turned toward the doorway, not to rejoin the conversation in the same way I had before, but to step back into that space with a different awareness, one that no longer required their approval to feel steady, one that did not need to correct or confront in the moment, because the moment itself was no longer where the real change would happen. And as I walked back out into the sunlight, I carried that quiet certainty with me, knowing that what had already been set in motion would speak for itself soon enough. I stepped back into the yard as if nothing had changed, the late afternoon light softer now, casting long shadows across the grass while conversations continued in small clusters, and I returned to my seat without drawing attention. The same chair, the same place setting, the same version of me they expected to see, and yet everything felt slightly out of alignment, like a picture frame that had been nudged just enough to notice if you were looking closely, and I wondered if anyone else could feel it or if it existed only within me. This quiet shift that no longer needed to be announced to be real. And Ashley was telling a story now, her voice animated, her hands moving lightly as she described something trivial with a confidence that suggested she believed she owned the space entirely. And people leaned in, listening, responding, reinforcing that sense of control she carried so effortlessly. And I watched her the way one watches a pattern finally understood, not with resentment, but with a kind of calm observation. Because once you see the structure beneath the behavior, it becomes predictable, almost rehearsed, and I could trace it backward through memory. The small comments that had seemed harmless at the time, the suggestions that gently redirected decisions, the moments when she spoke on Daniel's behalf as if it were natural, and I had allowed it, not because I was unaware, but because I believed harmony was worth preserving, even if it meant stepping aside more often than I should have. And now I could see how that space I left had been filled, not just by her presence, but by a version of the family that no longer included me in the way it once did. And Daniel laughed at something she said, the same easy laugh he used as a child when he felt safe. And for a moment, I felt that familiar pull, the instinct to hold on to that version of him, to believe it still existed unchanged beneath everything else. But then he glanced briefly in my direction and looked away, just as quickly, and the moment passed, leaving behind something quieter, more honest, and I realized that what I had been holding on to was not him as he was now, but the memory of who he had been. And memories, no matter how vivid, cannot sustain a present that has already moved on, and that understanding settled into me with a steady weight, not crushing, just definitive, and I reached for my glass of iced tea, noticing the condensation slipping down the side, pooling against my fingers, and I wiped it away with a napkin, a small, automatic gesture that felt almost symbolic, as if I were clearing something that no longer needed to linger. And nearby, someone mentioned plans for the upcoming holidays, voices overlapping as they discussed travel, schedules, arrangements, and I listened without inserting myself, noticing how easily decisions formed without my input, how naturally they moved forward as if my presence was optional, and perhaps it always had been, only I had not recognized it until now. And that thought did not sting the way it might have before. It clarified something. It simplified the choices ahead, because once you understand where you stand, you no longer waste energy trying to reposition yourself in a place that has already been defined. And Ashley glanced at me briefly, her expression polite, composed, unaware of anything beyond the surface. And I returned the look with the same calm neutrality, offering nothing more than what the moment required, because the need to explain, to correct, to reclaim something through words had already passed, replaced by a quieter certainty that did not depend on their recognition. And as the conversation shifted again, moving from one topic to another, I sat there with a stillness that felt different from before, not passive, not resigned, but deliberate, like standing at the edge of something that had already begun to change direction, knowing that what came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by a decision I had already made, one that did not need to be spoken to exist, one that would reveal itself in time, not through confrontation, but through absence, through silence, through the quiet removal of everything they had come to assume would always be there. As the afternoon stretched on, the gathering slowly shifted into that familiar rhythm where people grew more relaxed, voices a little louder, laughter a little easier, and I watched as plates were refilled and conversations overlapped without structure, the kind of scene I used to take pride in creating, but now I saw it from a distance, even while sitting right in the middle of it. And it gave me space to think more clearly about everything that had led to this moment, not just today, but over the past several years, because patterns like this do not appear overnight. They are built quietly through repetition, through moments that seemed too small to challenge at the time, and I could trace them back with surprising precision, like stepping stones I had once crossed without looking down. The first time Ashley suggested that it might be better if Daniel handled certain financial decisions without involving me, framed as independence, as growth, and I had agreed, proud that my son was building his own life, never questioning how that shift slowly removed me from conversations I had once been central to. And then there were the times I had covered unexpected expenses without being asked, a car repair here, a medical bill there, always offered with the intention of easing their burden, never mentioned again once it was done, not out of gratitude or even acknowledgement, but because it had quietly become expected, as if my role had transformed into something functional rather than relational. And I had accepted it, telling myself that helping family was its own reward, that love did not require recognition, and perhaps that was true, but what I had not realized was how easily that kind of giving could be redefined by others, how it could shift from generosity into obligation in their eyes, and eventually into something they believed they were entitled to. And I thought about the house itself, the one we were sitting behind, the one I had helped Daniel purchase years ago when he was just starting out, contributing more than I ever discussed, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted him to have stability, a place to build his future. And I remembered how grateful he had been then, how he had promised that this would always be my home too, a place where I would never feel like a guest. And yet here I was, sitting carefully in a chair that felt assigned rather than chosen, aware of the invisible boundaries that had formed around me. And I realized that promises, like roles, can be reshaped over time if no one insists on remembering them as they were originally given. And that thought did not bring anger. It brought clarity, because it meant that what I had been holding onto no longer existed in the same form. And that freed me from the responsibility of maintaining it alone. And as someone across the table began discussing future plans for expanding the house, adding another room, making changes that assumed permanence, I listened with a quiet understanding that those plans were built on assumptions that were no longer accurate, assumptions about what would always be available, about what would continue without question, and I almost smiled at the irony of it, not in a way that would draw attention, but in that internal way that comes when something finally makes sense, when all the scattered pieces align into a complete picture. And I realized that the decision I had made that morning was not just about one action. It was about redefining the structure they had come to rely on, not through confrontation, but through absence, through the removal of what they had mistaken for something that would always remain. And as I sat there, listening without interrupting, observing without reacting, I felt a steady calm settle deeper within me, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer adjusting myself to fit into their expectations. I was allowing those expectations to stand on their own, knowing that soon enough, they would have to face what remained when I quietly stepped out of the role they had built around me. By the time the sun began to dip lower and the air cooled just enough for people to start gathering their things, I could sense the subtle shift that happens at the end of these kinds of gatherings, when conversations become shorter, when people begin mentally moving on to what comes next. And I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my dress out of habit rather than necessity, taking one last look around the yard that had once felt like an extension of my own home. And I noticed how no one asked if I needed help carrying anything. No one paused to walk me to my car the way Daniel used to without being asked, and it was not said out loud, but it was understood that I would manage on my own, just as I always had. And that realization no longer carried the same quiet disappointment it once did. Instead, it confirmed something I had already accepted, that the role I had been holding on to had already ended, even if I had been the last to fully acknowledge it. And as I picked up the container I had brought earlier, now empty except for a few crumbs, I felt the weight of it in a different way, not as something to be refilled and brought again next time, but as something that marked a closing, a quiet end, to a pattern I would not be repeating. And Ashley called out a casual goodbye from across the yard, her tone light, her smile perfectly in place. as if the afternoon had unfolded exactly as she intended, and perhaps in her mind it had, because nothing on the surface had challenged her version of events. Nothing had disrupted the balance she believed she controlled, and I returned her smile with the same measured calm, offering no resistance, no indication that anything had changed beneath that surface, because the kind of change I had set in motion does not announce itself in moments like this. It reveals itself later, when expectations meet reality and find that something essential is no longer there. And Daniel approached then, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, almost distracted, and he said something about getting together again soon. The kind of automatic promise that fills space without requiring commitment. And I nodded, not correcting him, not reminding him of the many times those plans had quietly faded, because I no longer needed those assurances to feel secure. And as I walked toward my car, the gravel shifting under my shoes, I felt a steady sense of direction. That had nothing to do with where I was physically going, but everything to do with what I had already put into motion. And I thought again of that morning, of the final signature, of the moment everything that had once been assumed was formally redefined, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop negotiating your own value within spaces that have already decided it for you. And I realized that the quietest decisions are often the most powerful, because they do not rely on anyone else's understanding to take effect. They simply unfold in time, revealing themselves piece by piece until the full shape of them can no longer be ignored. And as I reached my car and set the container down on the passenger seat, I paused for a moment before starting the engine, looking back once more at the house, at the people who still believed everything was exactly as it had always been. And I felt no urge to go back, no need to linger, because, for the first time in a long time, I was not leaving something behind that I needed to hold on to. I was stepping away from something that had already let me go, and that difference made all the distance in the world. The drive home was quieter than usual, not because there was less traffic or fewer sounds, but because my mind was no longer trying to fill the silence with explanations, and I noticed that almost immediately, the absence of that constant internal negotiation that had followed me for years, the need to justify, to reinterpret, to soften what I already knew to be true. And as I turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway, I felt something settle into place with a kind of quiet finality. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just certain. And I sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine, my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel as I looked at the familiar outline of my home, the place that had always been mine without question, without conditions, and I realized how important that distinction had become. Because there was a time when I believed that sense of belonging extended equally into Daniel's life, into his home, into the spaces we once shared, without hesitation. But now I understood that belonging, when it is no longer mutual, becomes something else entirely, something that cannot be maintained by effort alone. And I stepped out of the car and walked inside, setting the empty container on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I had prepared countless meals not just for myself, but for others, meals that had traveled to places where I had slowly become less essential. And I looked around at the quiet of my own space, the order of it, the familiarity, and I felt no sense of loss, only clarity, because this was where I still existed fully, without adjustment, without expectation, without the need to measure my presence against someone else's convenience. And I moved through the house slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of intention, noticing small things I had overlooked before, the way the light came through the window at this time of day, the way the air felt steady and unchanged, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I needed to do next for someone else. I was thinking about what I would choose to do for myself, and that thought felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, just new, like stepping into a space that had always been there, but never fully used. And I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept important papers, opening the drawer with a calm that matched the rest of the day, and I placed my hand briefly on the folder that had been returned to me that morning, not opening it, not reviewing it again, because I did not need to. Everything inside it had already been decided, and that was the part that mattered, the decision itself, not the documentation. And I closed the drawer and stepped back, feeling no urgency, no need to rush what would come next, because I understood now that timing was not something I needed to control. It would unfold naturally, as it always does when the foundation of something has quietly changed, and I thought about Daniel, about the way he had avoided my eyes, about the easy agreement he had given through silence, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel that fully, not pushing it away, not reshaping it into something softer, just accepting it as it was, and then I let it settle, because holding on to it would not change what had already been set in motion. And as evening began to take hold, the house growing dimmer with the fading light, I turned on a single lamp and sat down in my chair, not to wait, not to plan further, but simply to be present in a space that no longer required me to prove my place within it. And that was when I understood that what I had done that morning was not just about removing myself from something that no longer valued me. It was about reclaiming a version of my life that had been quietly set aside for far too long, and this time, I was not going to give it away again. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet morning that does not demand anything from you, and I moved through it slowly, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light settle into the room as if it had always belonged there. And for the first time in a long while, I did not check my phone out of habit, did not look for messages or missed calls that might require a response, because I already understood something had shifted, not just in what I had done, but in what I was willing to respond to. And it was not until later, when I finally glanced at the screen, that I saw Daniel's name, a missed call, followed by a short message asking if everything was all right, and I read it once, then again, noticing the simplicity of it, the absence of context, as if he sensed something but did not yet understand what it was, and I set the phone back down without replying, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing immediate to say, nothing that could be explained in a single message without unraveling something that was not meant to be discussed in that way. And I went about my morning as I had planned, stepping outside for a brief walk, feeling the steady rhythm of my own pace, noticing how different it felt to move without the weight of anticipation, without the constant awareness of how my actions might fit into someone else's expectations. And by the time I returned home, there was another message, this one longer, asking if I had made it home safely, if I needed anything, the kind of questions that sounded attentive but carried a tone I recognized, one that appeared when something did not align with what was expected, and I understood that this was the beginning of it, not the confrontation, not the full realization, but the first subtle indication that something had changed in a way they could not immediately define. And I placed my phone on the table again, not ignoring it, simply allowing the moment to unfold without rushing to fill it, because timing, I had learned, was part of the clarity I now carried, and I knew that what would come next would not be a single conversation, but a series of realizations that would take shape as their expectations met a reality that no longer supported them. And I thought about the plans they had discussed the day before, the assumptions about what would continue, the ease with which those plans had been spoken, and I could almost see the moment, not yet arrived, when those assumptions would be questioned, when something small would not happen the way they expected, and then something else, and gradually the pattern would reveal itself, not through explanation, but through absence, through the quiet removal of what had once been consistent. And I moved through the rest of the day with that understanding, not waiting, not watching for a reaction, simply living within the space I had reclaimed. And when my phone rang again in the afternoon, Daniel's name appearing once more, I let it ring until it stopped, not because I was unwilling to speak to him, but because the conversation he was expecting belonged to a version of me that no longer existed in the same way, and I knew that when we did speak, it would not be about reassurance or adjustment. It would be about something much more fundamental, something that could not be softened or reshaped to fit the comfort of the moment. And as the evening settled in, I sat in the quiet of my home, the same steady calm surrounding me, and I realized that the shift had already begun to reach them, not fully, not clearly, but enough to create that first sense of uncertainty, the kind that grows when something familiar no longer behaves the way it always has. And I understood that this was how it would unfold, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small, undeniable changes that would eventually form a truth they could not ignore. And when that moment came, I would not need to explain it, because by then, they would already understand exactly what had changed and why. It did not take long for the pattern to break in ways they could no longer ignore, because by the end of the week, the first real shift surfaced in something small, almost insignificant on its own. Daniel called again. But this time there was a different tone in his voice when I finally answered, less casual, more uncertain, and he asked about a payment, something he had assumed would go through as it always had, something tied to the house. And I listened quietly as he explained, hearing the confusion beneath his words, the way he tried to piece together why something so routine had suddenly stopped without warning. And I did not interrupt. I let him finish, because understanding requires space. And when he finally paused, waiting for an explanation, I simply told him that things had changed, not in a harsh way, not in a way meant to provoke, just a simple statement delivered without apology or hesitation. And there was a silence on the other end that felt longer than it actually was, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer as stable as they believed. And he asked what I meant, his voice careful now, and I could hear it clearly, the beginning of that shift, the moment when assumption meets reality and does not quite know how to respond. And I told him that I would no longer be covering expenses or stepping in where I was not asked with respect, that I had made decisions about my finances that reflected what I had come to understand, and I did not elaborate beyond that, because the details were not the point, the change itself was. And again there was that quiet pause, followed by a question that carried both confusion and a hint of something else, something closer to concern, asking if something had happened, if he had done something wrong. And I considered that for a moment, not out of doubt, but because the answer was not as simple as he hoped it might be. And I told him that nothing had happened suddenly, that this was not about one moment or one comment, but about a pattern that had become clear over time. And I kept my voice steady, not accusing, not emotional, just honest, because honesty does not need to be loud to be understood. And I could feel the conversation shifting, the ease that once defined it replaced by something more careful, more aware, and I knew that he was beginning to see what he had not seen before, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that something fundamental had changed. And he mentioned Ashley then, asking if this had anything to do with her, and I did not answer that directly, not because it was not relevant, but because placing the focus on one person would have allowed him to simplify something that was more complex. And I told him instead that this was about me, about what I was willing to continue and what I was not. And that distinction mattered, because it shifted the responsibility back to where it belonged, not on a single moment or a single person, but on a dynamic that had developed over time. And the conversation ended without resolution, without agreement, but with something more important, an awareness that could not be undone. And when I set the phone down, I did not feel relief or regret. I felt something quieter, something steady, the kind of certainty that does not depend on how others respond. And in the days that followed, I knew there would be more conversations, more questions, perhaps even attempts to return things to what they had been. But I also knew that what had been was no longer something I would step back into. Because once you see your place clearly, you cannot pretend not to see it again. And as I moved through my home that evening, the same calm surrounding me, I understood that the shift was no longer just mine. It had reached them now. And whether they chose to understand it or resist it, it would remain, because I was no longer living within the version of the story they had created. I was living within one I had finally chosen for myself.